Exhaustion gripped Hyde as it had never done before. His old bones creaked and cracked with each movement, and he wondered if he looked as dead on his feet as he felt. Hours had passed since the armies of Ernhome had sallied forth into the bowels of the mountain, one final time to face the beast below, and still no word of either victory or defeat had been heard. Hyde maintained his position on the battlements of the barricade between the city's industrial district and the mines, refusing food or sleep until he had seen through this duty until the end. As Lord Vizier, and now Lord Regent in the king's absence, he had no other choice. Not for the first time he found himself yearning that the burden could have passed to someone else. He thought about whispering a prayer to the One as he stood, leaning on his walking stick heavily, but eventually decided against it. In these dark days, he had grown less and less certain that the One was listening at all, at least not to the likes of them. The strength of his faith had, in recent years, waned as the war stretched onwards and hope grew fainter and fainter. He wondered, idly, if his cousin was dead yet, or if he was still marching at the front of the column. He was proud of Rye, though he was already mourning the inevitable death that the old Dwarrow was certain to suffer down beneath the earth. Foot over foot, he hobbled along the raised walkway, overlooking the yawning mouth of the chasm from which the enemy would normally issue. He carried no timepiece, but could estimate that it had been 4 hours since the very last stragglers at the end of their column had disappeared into the inky blackness of the mountain's gullet, and not a single soul had yet returned. He wondered if he should be excited or fearful for that. Those very few men who remained with him at the barricades seemed to settle on general uneasiness, and the atmosphere was still tense, even after all this time spent waiting. The women and children had long since dispersed, gone home to mourn the husbands, fathers, and brothers that they were sure to have just lost, or else to simply wait and prepare for death. They stood now in the eye of the storm, the whole city waiting on the inhale to see if this would be Ernhome's final gasp or not.
"My Lord Vizier Hyde?"
A voice from beside him startled him awake, and Hyde realized rather sheepishly that he had almost dozed off on his feet, still striding forwards mindlessly, his body performing even as his mind wandered off. He took note of the younger Dwarrow who had called to him. Little more than a boy, a child in oversized armor, and bearing a spear that seemed far too long for his slight frame. Most of the men of Ernhome who were still alive these days seemed far younger than Hyde was comfortable. Most of the men of Ernhome who were still alive these days seemed far younger than Hyde was comfortable with. But whom else could be relied on? Even children had to step into their father's shoes in these dark times. "Speak, boy," he croaked, shaking his head and doing his best to clear vision that had blurred. His eyes were worse than ever in recent years, and Hyde wondered how soon he could expect them to give out on him entirely. How horribly unfair it was that an old bastard like him was still alive, when so many strong young men had perished in this decade of misery. The young Dwarrow looked nervously to the side, as if afraid to voice his thoughts. At length he mustered courage and spoke.
Do you think that they're going to win? King Andronax and the others. Do you think they'll come back alive?"
Hyde met the child's gaze, fighting the urge to speak truthfully. He did his best to hold together the broken remnants of his spirit and flash a smile that held at least a little bit of warmth. "We can pray that it is so, my boy."
The priests say that the One is on our side, that he will send his fairies to aid us. But nobody has come. Do you think it is hopeless, my lord?
Hyde pinched the bridge of his nose, drawing together his bushy eyebrows so tightly that his entire face appeared to crumble in on itself. He wondered how best to answer. Against his best judgment, he heaved a great and exhausted sigh. He was far too old to be the one anybody turned to in order to inspire hope. But the king and the princes and all those brave and noble sorts were down below, perhaps already languishing in the jaws of devils. He was the only authority left in Ernhome that these despondent and desperate people could rely on. Reluctantly, he met the boy's gaze once more. "I do not know," he answered truthfully. "I pray that it is not so hopeless as it seems. Perhaps the One is testing our faith. He carves the world in mysterious ways, ways impossible for us mortals to comprehend."
Did you ever meet a fae, my lord? I mean, before all of this, back when they were still about?
At this, Hyde almost smiled. The youngster was clearly showing his age now. Hyde was old for a Dwarrow, yes, pushing dangerously close to 70 years walking this world. But the fae had been fleeing from the mortal world for years, even before he was born. Even at the time of the Second War of Wrath, before the birth of their people, the fae had retreated to the fair and wild places of the world, becoming one with nature, fading into tidal waves or volcanoes or mighty winds. Rare indeed it had been, even in Hyde's childhood, to even have met someone who had spoken to a fairy, much less hold audience with one yourself. Andronax and the line of Dwarrow kings were the only ones privileged enough to regularly speak to that ancient and blessed people, and even the royals had not made contact with the fae since the start of this new war. Truthfully, Hyde had met fae before, a few times when he had been a young man, and he had found them irritatingly whimsical at the time. He wondered if they would possess that same sense of whimsy now, while looking into the gullet of oblivion. Just as many preachers as had predicted their salvation at the hands of the One and his fae had predicted that these were the end of all days. "I have, yes," he finally gave the child his answer. "A long, long time ago."
What were they like?
The boy's face had lit up. He was gazing at Hyde now with great interest rather than dread and trepidation. Hyde had to remind himself that this was not a soldier, not really. This was a child, whose days should be spent at play or study of a trade under the guidance of his father, not stood atop the battlements of a city besieged, holding back the spawn of a black sire from overtaking the world. His heart sank for all the children who would likely never know peace in their lifetimes, however short those lifetimes may end up being. He supposed that to bring a little light to this unhappy city was the least that he could do for its inhabitants. Hyde smiled warmly, thinking back to the days before Dwarrow country had spiraled out of control. He thought of his days as a butler in the house of King Kellamanax before he had gone mad and become Kellaman the Tyrant. "Well, my boy, you would hardly know that you were looking at one until they spoke. Fairies are almost impossible to see unless you know what to look for."
As light and sound. That's what the Argenta says.
The child interrupted, and for an instant he was only a child again, not the soldier that their long and hopeless vigil had transformed him into. A child who wanted to hear tales of the fair folk. "Indeed, and it is so, at least when they deign it to be so. Still, if you know what to look for, you can sometimes spot them, like motes of dust caught in a ray of sunlight, or a rainbow stretched between storm clouds." Hyde did his best to describe the feeling of looking at an entity that was there, but was not there all at once. It was difficult to put into words how it felt to spy, in the corners of one's vision, the silhouettes of forms who had left their flesh behind centuries ago.
What reason did they have to show themselves to you, my lord? If you don't mind my asking.
The boy remembered his manners, just after the rather personal question had passed his lips. Hyde sighed again, casting his mind far back into his memories and settling into a deep lean on his old walking stick. I was a very young man the first time I ever met them, the Fae, though, truth be told, I only met more than a handful of them at once. It was a single fairy who I had caught the interest of, and she did not make herself known to me until she and her friends had taken some time to observe me. The boy had laid down his spear and was sitting in front of Hyde, cross-legged now. He pretended not to notice that he was beginning to garner a small audience. Haggard youths who had been left behind to guard the city were gathered around now, as well as old veterans who might even remember the times that Hyde was reminiscing about. All those fit to man the battlements, but not fit enough to take part in the vanguard, seemed to gather round him to listen to the story of the Lord Vizier's youth. A time when he was young and strong, and filled with a great passion for life and for living, before his bones had grown weary and his flesh sagged, before strength turned to infirmity, and spontaneous naivete gave way to cold, wretched wisdom. You see, in those days, before Andronax's father, Kellerman, had lost his mind, much was right in Dwarrow country. The fields were green beyond the borders of Ernhome, and the mountain's gates were flung wide. There was far less worry and more cheer in the lives of our people. A time of plenty and of great comfort. I only wish that I could take you back to see it for yourself, when the Dwarrow were at our mightiest. Even the troll cities across the sea respected us, paid in gold and jewels for the crafts our most skillful smiths and artisans shaped through cunning and prowess in their trades. I was, in those days, a simple steward in the royal household, a young butler with a sharp eye and swifter feet than I've got now, I can tell you. While so many of my fellow youngsters had up and joined the garrisons here in Ernhome, some seeking glory and others adventure, I had stayed behind. I have never had any interest in the martial, as strange as it may sound for a young man. My life was in the world of books and treatises, the history of our people and the future that awaited us. I waited upon the high nobility of Ernhome, bringing food and drink to visiting dukes and city lords from the southern coasts of Dwarrow country, all the way up to the Red Sea and beyond. Oh, we had many guests in those days, and if you have a keen eye yourself, you may have seen one of them still roaming Ernhome to this day. Old Gwythain, the chronicler, the only troll resident of our city. Though he seldom leaves the palace nowadays, he was much more active throughout the reign of Kellermanax, before the king went mad, and... Rye realized even as he spoke that he was allowing himself to ramble on, and for his mind to once again turn towards darker topics of conversation. Better not to focus on the Civil War and the madness of Kellerman the Tyrant. Better instead to let a story of Fey whimsy and his open, carefree youth help whisk these frightened young people away from their misery, if only for a little while. In any case, I had been outside of the mountain walls for the day when I met them, or rather when they revealed themselves to me. It happened that I was enjoying a climb along the eastern slopes of the mountainside, where the cliffs are gentle and the drops not too steep, and a thick wood covered the spurs like moss on the side of a stone. It was a favorite spot for me to go whenever I had a moment to myself away from my duties, and I wanted to be alone with my thoughts and with my pen hand. The vistas that could be seen from the mountain face were more breathtaking than the fairest Dwarrow maid or troll maid I could ever have imagined. and I often took the time, so long as I was alone, to sketch and draw and try to capture with charcoal on a page the beauty that surrounded me.
I never thought about an older fellow liking to draw, my lord.
The boy soldier interrupted again, scratching his nose.
My father used to say that there was no use for it outside of map-making, that a man should use his hands to make something useful. That's what he would say anyways, not me, my lord.
The boy seemed almost apologetic, and Hyde cracked a wry smile. Ah, and in these darker times I would agree with your father. But in those days it was the time of artists and of storytellers. There were no wars to fight, no enemies to watch for, and even the laziest layabout had money to spend and food for his belly, and all of us had time to pursue whatever objects took our fancy. That was not entirely true, but Hyde didn't see the harm in embellishing the glories of the past just a touch for the sake of his audience. If the end of the world was fast approaching, there could be very little harm in trying to paint a brighter picture of what they would be leaving behind them. In any case, I was watching the sun slowly set across the horizon, watching the light splay across the haze of clouds between me and the edge of the world, and the way that ripples of green rode with the breeze across the tops of the forests down below me, turning brilliant gold wherever the woods gave way to the wheat and barley fields beyond the mountain's feet. And I was just lifting my pencil to try and begin a sketch when I heard someone giggling nearby.
And was that the fairy?
Asked a new audience member, a young girl standing beside a taller youth who must have been her brother, carrying a bucket filled with long quarrels that would fit to the boy's crossbow if the need arose. Hyde wished she was carrying a doll or a stuffed toy instead. Yes, child, he said gently, thinking back and remembering those days so vividly that he half hoped he could bring himself back to that moment. He tried to recall the details of the conversation, though it had been so long ago that he feared he would have to paraphrase.
Look here, watch the silly mortal fumble, looking to capture a sunset on a tablet,
said somebody near to me, but I could not see whom. He mimicked the soft, vaguely musical timbre of the voice he still dreamt about at night, knowing that his own mortal body could never hope to replicate the delicate beauty of Faye's speech. Well, I leapt right up to see who was watching me. I was shy about my hobby, and never liked to draw a thing when anybody was around to see me. But no matter where I looked, I could not see anyone there. "Who is there?" I called. "Show yourself to me." And all I got in reply was a small chorus of different voices laughing together, not out of spite, but only in good-natured mirth. I was halfway tempted to laugh at myself, turning about in circles like a whirligig, searching for nobody. Of course, I knew at once that I was encountering the Fae, and I knew, as I am certain you all know, that you must always mind your manners when you speak to the children of the One. "Forgive me," I said aloud, "but I thought that I was alone here. May I ask who you are and what interest you have in myself?" Well, there was silence for a moment, and then that same voice spoke up again. I could tell it was the same one. I don't know how I knew, but I knew. "You know who we are," said the voice. "You have only just begun to try and mimic us, as ridiculous a notion as that might be. Don't you, Dwarrow, know that mortal hands could never equal the glory of the carver's work?" She seemed so incredulous, so innocently unable to grasp the idea of drawing a picture, that I could not help but laugh in full this time, for I knew exactly which Fae had come to accost me.
"Sunset fairies?"
breathed the little girl, excitedly, and Hyde felt as though now he could not stop grinning whatsoever. "That's exactly right. The fairies who govern the sunsets, or at least a small group of them. You see, they will often set to their tasks about the world, and never so much as acknowledge that we are here, unless we do something that interests them. And ever since the Second War of Wrath, the fairies had largely stopped taking an interest in the affairs of mortals at all. But this one had taken notice of me. Ira was her name, though I would not come to know it until much later on, and Hyde never got the opportunity to finish telling the story, for all at once there came a great clamor from beyond the stockade, and the entire assembly leapt to their feet, all in a panic, as tales of sunsets and laughing fairies disappeared from their minds. Hyde felt his own face go pale, the blood draining from it, as he heard the sounds of shouting and screaming issue forth from the throat of the mines, as if the world itself were crying out in pain and terror. "Weapons ready?" He hobbled on his stick towards the edge of the parapet, seeing the garish red glow of flames illuminate the walls of the cavern, and he waited to see what would emerge. This, he could gather already, was no victorious promenade. The war was far from ended. Men spilled out from the tunnel entrance, hundreds in a tide that spilled over itself in terror as they all rushed for the gates, shrieking and begging for them to open. Confusion ran rampant, some of the recruits rushing to do as they were bid and haul open the gates of the stockade, while Hyde's cries for order were drowned out and others took aim with weapons in a panic. This far from where he stood, Hyde could see no sign of the disgusting mottled skin and languorous maggoty bodies of the children of the Pale Lady, but that did not mean that they would not be nearby. He cast his gaze about for someone he recognized, a commanding officer or familiar face who could give him some inkling of what was happening. Where, he wondered fearfully, was Andronax? Where were any of the princes, or the king's lance? What had happened in the dark below the earth? He wondered if he truly wished to know it all. A sudden flash of bright silver caught his eye, even as voices bellowed for order and drowned one another out in a cacophony of words. Someone started a chant, and it was picked up by the less hysterical of the soldiers who now milled about outside the gates. "Make way! Make way for Christofax! Make way for the king!" Hyde saw him clearly then, the sagging, crumpled, forlorn sight of the crown prince being dragged through the throngs of terrified men by a familiar figure. He recognized his cousin's face even from this distance, and with a fervor that surprised even himself at his age, he sprang for the stairs leading down to the road and made all haste to greet his prince and family. Rye's helmet was missing, his face pale and drawn, and a mix of vomit and gore spattered the front of his cuirass as he staggered in through the gates, pulling the limp Christofax along with him. "Rye!" Hyde called out, rushing to try and meet them as panicked soldiers forgot all manner of discipline and rushed to get in through the gates and away from whatever it was in the tunnels that had rooted them. "Rye, what has happened? Where is the king?" Hyde asked, even as he already knew the answer. The voices who had called out Christofax's arrival had said, "Make way for the king." Andronax, his old friend, was dead. The king's lance was nowhere to be found, and neither were any of the king's other sons who had ventured down into the depths with him. All at once, as the gates slammed shut behind them, Christofax lurched to his feet and flung Rye off of him with a roar. "Traitor!" he snarled, stumbling, nearly falling, and then making as if he would hurl himself atop Rye in anger. The retired fifth spear sagged where he stood, made no effort to defend himself, and Hyde saw how his cousin's single eye refused to look directly at the incensed prince. Leaning heavily on his cane, Hyde placed himself between the two Dwarrow, holding out thin arms to try and keep Christofax from charging. "Your Majesty, please! This panic does no good for the city. Tell us what has happened. Is the Pale Lady destroyed?" Even as he asked, once again he knew the answer, but Hyde had to hear it from his new king's mouth all the same. He had to know it for certain that hope was lost. Christofax's lips were drawn back in a grimace of rage and pain. One arm curled across his side, while the other stabbed out an accusatory finger at Rye. "Ask that one! Ask that snake why we have failed, why my father is dead! I didn't know, mumbled Ryan numbly, standing while seeming to bear such weight on his shoulders that it seemed as if he would be crushed into paste beneath it. I'd understood that if anyone was going to salvage the situation, it would have to be him. King Christofax, you are wounded. Our people have lost too much, I take it, for one day, without their new king raging unto his own death. Come, we will return you to the palace to have the physicians examine you, and you may tell me what has happened once that is done. Why bother? A passing soldier remarked brokenly. The city is doomed. Nothing can stop her. Nothing. Hyde opened his mouth to answer, but was stopped as Christofax's hand shot out and grasped the collar of his shirt with fervor that belied his injuries. His eyes, wide and lustrous with manic passion, the king pulled Hyde closer and hissed into his face. No rest. I rule now. Open the gates. Evacuate the city. I want this mountain emptied of every soldier and citizen. Andronax is dead. Our vigil is ended. I will not see Ernhome's people bled to the last when their lives might be spared. Of course, Highness. I will see it done. But what about... As for you, Vizier, take 6 strong horses and fly from here. Fly southwards and bring me back my wife. Hyde twisted to try and free himself from the king's grip, but failed. Sire, please, be reasonable. It is not safe here for... Death comes for me, Hyde. I will see my sons, my bride, one last time before my end. You have your orders, now go! Unless you would risk the same wrath I intend to exact upon this treacherous vermin! He gestured to Rye, who made no attempt to flee or to defend himself. Hyde could not imagine what had happened. What had Rye done? Could his cousin, a man he had always known to be stalwart and true in the face of danger, truly have turned traitor? But if Rye had been seduced by the pernicious whispers of the archenemy and come under her thrall, why had he returned to the city instead of cleaving to the side of his new mistress? Hyde could not believe it. Was this rage induced because Rye had dragged Christofax away from the battle, instead of allowing him to die with his brothers? There was no way to know, and Christofax was too far gone to explain in a way that made sense to him. Still, Hyde was Lord Regent in Andronax's absence, and, technically, the crown had not formally been passed to Christofax as of yet. He could, if he thought it best for the city, refuse the order. It would be madness to bring the new queen consort and the young crown princes back to this nightmare, would it not? How could he justify dragging them into the jaws of damnation? Ernhome was doomed, that much he knew, but what was Christofax's plan? They could run, certainly, but go where? Where in the world could the Dwarrow flee to where the children of the Pale Lady would not follow? They bred faster than any creature that walked the earth, and their hunger eclipsed all else. It would be foolish to do as Christofax said. And then again, Hyde realized, what else could he do? Seize power over a dying city? Revolt against the royal family he had sworn an oath to serve until death? And for what? To eke out, perhaps, a few more days' worth of peace for the rest of Dwarrow country, before the Black Sire burst forth from the mountain's bowels and claimed hundreds of thousands of more lives? Christofax had been down there in the darkness. He had seen the face of their enemy, and his orders were now to flee from Ernhome. The Dwarrow had been defeated. Hyde had not seen what his king had, what had claimed the lives of Andronax and the elite soldiery of their people. Perhaps it would serve Hyde better to put his pride aside and do as he was bidden. He did not even know if the stable still had 6 strong horses left, or if the people had eaten them all in the days of starvation throughout the siege. Could a man of his age and infirmity even make such a wild flight without falling dead on the roadside? All he saw around them were barrels and barrels stacked high and filled with volatile fuel for burning. They could do nothing for the people with that. The choice is yours.